All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to what used to be entitled the talk called From Zero to 1,000 Apps. So actually, when I submitted this talk, a couple things have changed. So we're up to actually somewhere around 3,000 apps in the last year of Cloud Foundry at Home Depot. So what are we going to talk about today? I'll introduce myself briefly. Won't spend too much time on that. It's not very interesting. We'll set some expectations in case some of you would like to leave a little early. And we're going to spend most of the time reminiscing and learning and spending some time over a lot of the things that we've done in the last year. So we're going to do this on a month-by-month basis. Stick with me. It gets better at the end. And then, of course, we'll have a bit of an aha moment at the end where I think it's a big epiphany, but if you spent the talk with Miss Davis from Pivotal yesterday, she probably spoiled the end moment for you. But and then if we have time, we'll spend some questions. So real quick, my name's Anthony McCulley. I'm a manager at Home Depot for the applications platform team. It fits under the umbrella of enterprise architecture. I spent about 15 years total in IT. The first half of that doing consulting for network, servers, migrations, Citrix, Exchange, all that fun stuff. Got involved in a startup, sold my way out of that, paid off my debt, and decided to go back to school and do computer science because I wanted to be a game developer. So I've spent the last 7 or 8 years doing software, not making games. During that time, I've been mixed up with user experience. I spent my undergrad research doing children as design partners, which is really beneficial for working in big companies in software development. I've also done a lot of computer science stuff, worked for Comcast, GE, several Fortune 500 companies, a few startups, so I've seen kind of both ends of the spectrum. So for expectations, so this is a talk about being a platform operator of Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Not just that, but sort of what that means to the greater organization. I personally think it's one of the most important jobs you can have at your company if you're interested in making change and enabling change. So what does that mean? So for us, we get to wear lots of hats, and that's pretty cool and it's fun. We spend about 50% of our time developing on a good day. We spend a lot more of our time monitoring customer service, customer support, upgrading build packs, doing all sorts of fun things, right? So that's the fun part of it. The not fun part of it is sort of internally, this is what it feels like to us, is that it feels like we're juggling chainsaws and fires all day long. And it feels very unsafe. And while we're doing that, we have to sort of put on the good face for everyone else who's using the platform and pretend that everything is just fine. And it's hard to do both at the same time. But the team's done a really good job sort of settling into this role. All right, so what does a year-long retrospective look like? Well, there's going to be a few things that went well. There's going to be probably a few more things that did not go well. And there's going to be one thing that went really bad. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then, like I said, at the very end, we'll have a surprise reveal of what I think being a platform operator actually means. You will not find out who wins Game of Thrones. If you watch The Walking Dead, you will not find out which one of these two characters dies. The team and I are probably split on who we think it is. But at the very end, I promise there will be something that I think is kind of cool. So are we ready? If so, here is the first Google time machine I could find on Google Images. And we'll go to June 2015. So this is a graphic that you'll see each month. It's sort of tracking our app instances by month. And as you can imagine, on June 15, there's not a whole lot going on. We don't know what's going on. I hadn't even joined the team yet. Dylan, sitting here in the front row, worked closely with Pivotal and some of their partners, and we actually stood up Cloud Foundry on-prem. That's about the extent of what I know, so we're going to skip ahead to July 2015. And we know a little bit more, not really. So this is where I kind of come onto the scene. So there's already a team in place at Home Depot who is known as the application platforms team. And this team already has a platform that they've built from scratch by hand, that they're already supporting. It's Java-based, it's physical hardware, and it's serving almost all of the applications that are running on Home Depot. And it's actually doing it very reliably and very well. And then I come along, new to, I don't even know what platform as a service means, let alone this big thing I'm lugging behind me called Pivotal Cloud Foundry that someone else stood up. And so then my leadership and I decided to throw that onto the heap to the team that already has a platform. So what do you guys think could possibly go wrong when we have a team already in place with a platform and we decide to bring a new shiny one in place and throw it right on top? Any takers? Who wants to be the first one to speak? This is an interactive session, people. So, anyone? I heard a voice.
There will be resistance to change.
There will be resistance to change. All right.
That's the polite way of putting it.
Resistance to change. Yep. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's totally okay to be resistant to change. So for me, I think one of the very first lessons that we learned is that you really have to be empathetic to the people, the processes, and the technology that are already in place, right? You have people that put sweat, blood, and tears into building a thing that's being used. And then you have this new thing that kind of comes along, and it's promising, rainbows and butterflies and unicorns. And so there's lots of very natural questions that arise, right? There's questions like, well, what was wrong with the old thing? What's going to happen to the old thing? Did I build something wrong? What's going to happen to my job, right? So there's all these really, really cool, interesting questions. And I think we could have done a better job being more empathetic and anticipating those and sort of worked on our communication about some of those topics. So what else happened in July of 2015? So at this point in time, there's 2 teams, I believe, that are using Cloud Foundry. And I think, but don't quote me, it's as a result of doing labs projects. There's 3 foundations that are installed. This is part of the work that was done initially. So there's a sandbox environment, which is what we use as a platform team to do test out upgrades and so forth. And then we have non-prod and production. We built them as 2 separate foundations for reasons that I won't get into now. But we try to keep those 2 foundations as identical as possible. That's trying to do the whole 12-factor thing and keep things good and consistent. And at this point in time, right, it's really early. I don't even know what a PaaS is. We don't know anything about how many app instances are running. We sort of don't care about these metrics. It's sort of still kind of this niche thing in a corner of Home Depot. All right, well, let's fast forward a little bit to August of 2015. And I think this is when we, someone, probably Pivotal, started caring about like how much stuff are we running. It's a small number, but I promise it says 73. So there's 73 app instances running across all of our foundations at Home Depot. So there's another very interesting thing that happened in August of 2015. So 2 weeks after accepting a new position in an area that I knew almost nothing about, my boss decides to ask me to stand in front of our entire development community and introduce PCF to all 3,000 of our developers. So I do that, really not knowing anything about what I'm talking about. And I'm saying, ta-da, here's PCF. It's really awesome. You should go use it. And I'm just saying that because I believe someone who said it, right? So the other lesson that comes up here, I think, it's an important one, is I think you have to let your community know that a thing exists and it's real, right? So there are all these rumors going around about PCF. Only the cool kids are working on PCF, right? Only the labs projects. How do I get to PCF? What is it? I want to use it and so forth. So I think there's a lot of value in sort of putting a stake in the ground and just saying, hey, everybody, here's a thing. It's early. Bear with us. There's going to be growing pains. And so what are some of those growing pains? So at the time, the platform required permission to use it. So someone would literally have to email us or come talk to us and say, hey, I'm interested in using Pivotal Cloud Foundry. What do I have to do? And then we would have to go in and add them to an Active Directory group, which would then give them access to the platform. There was nothing self-service about it at all. Like if you went to PDubs in the cloud, right, or Amazon or anything like that, you can just go there, sign up, get stuff. And that's what developers are used to, but this isn't how it was working for us this early on. And this was another thing. We had no idea how to charge for it. And so we did what any responsible company does, and we just decided not to yet. And we were like, we'll figure that part out later. So in that initial offering, we had a couple of pilot teams on labs who sort of fronted the bill for the initial hardware and licensing to get everything set up. And we're like, let's go ahead and open it up and see if there's anyone else interested who might use it. Another interesting thing that happens in August of 2015 is one of those teams that was working on the labs projects actually goes to try to put their first app into production. And I can't stress enough how important it is to get that first app into production on a new platform, because you're going to discover all sorts of things about your company when that happens. What we discovered is that something that should take just a few seconds or minutes ended up taking 4.5 hours. I won't bring all that back up again, but I will say that it had a lot to do with our processes, compliance, roles and responsibilities, politics within the company. There was all sorts of things, and a lot of it was actually a lack of education, especially on my part. I was taking very literal certain rules about separations of duty and SOX compliance, and the teams, we wouldn't let the teams push their own code into production, so we went and grabbed the people that typically put code in production and sat them down in front of a console and were like, just type this. And they were like, well, what am I typing? What does it mean? So it was a mess. But needless to say, we got through it, and there was a lot of outcome from that, and I'll touch on that in a moment. So we're going to skip ahead. It's September 2015. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. We have plenty of time for discussions and debates. And if I feel like we're getting behind, I'll speed us back up and take questions at the end. But so feel free to ask questions. So in 2015, we're up to 150 app instances. So you essentially doubled in 1 month. And why is that? So lots of reasons. We made an announcement, right? But it's not super easy to get yet. So one of the things that we did as an outcome from this retrospective that we had with this team is we decided to just give devs the key to production. So we're like, you know what? I don't know if I'm allowed to or not, but go ahead and push your code to production. We'll find out what happens. And despite all the rumors about the buildings burning down and the wrath and lightning bolts and all that stuff, nothing happened. The team was able to push their stuff into production, and everything went really well. So this brings up another important lesson that I think it's a really good opportunity to use new things as an excuse to question everything and do things differently. So we kind of use Cloud Foundry as sort of like this catalyst or excuse to be like, well, we don't have to do things the old way, right? Like this is cloud native. We're trying to do things new, right? DevOps and all these buzzwords. And so this really started having some interesting email conversations and escalations and all sorts of cool talks. But I think it's really important as a platform operator, if you're trying to push that envelope of change, kind of ask for forgiveness instead of permission and sort of see what happens. So, all right, so what else happened in the month of September? So like I said, we gave the dev teams the ability to be an org manager of their own orgs in production. And this is kind of a new concept at Home Depot. A lot of production teams didn't have any direct access to production with the other platform. All of their deployments went through Opsware and scheduling and so forth. So this was kind of a new idea for us. Luckily, there was nothing super critical going into production, which I should include that as a lesson. I highly recommend that. Start with something low risk and kind of ramp up from there. Ultimately, I was a big fan of chargebacks. I was like, if I go to the internet and I sign up for stuff, they're going to ask for a credit card, and that's going to keep me honest. And but ultimately, I was overruled. We decided to no chargebacks, and for good reasons. Our company, our PMO, our financials, we just weren't set up really to take project codes and then use those as credit cards. So it wasn't going to work out anyway. But anyway, the good news is, depending on how you look at it, is that PCF is, air quote, free to use. So obviously, it costs the company money, but it doesn't cost the project teams. And so the way we handled this is we sort of categorized the platform as a utility, much the same way that we do some of our other things that we provide, like networking, electricity, a bunch of other stuff, right? So that's how we kind of do it. And Dylan's team and his leadership is sort of in charge of ensuring there's funding for that and keeping sort of ahead of demand, which you'll see is very difficult to do. And another interesting thing, and you're going to see a couple other things thrown in here that are not platform related, so Slack. At this point in time, there are several teams at Home Depot that are sort of stood up their own Slack channels. on different servers and not providers, but they all sort of have their own instances of Slack running. And my team was the same way, and we had, I think, probably 15, 20 people in it. And this will be pertinent later on when we talk about that. So, all right, fast forward, October 2015. Any questions on the last part, by the way, or comments? Yep.
I just want to ask a couple of questions that you can answer later. When you say apps and apps instances, what's the difference? And one question. The other one is, what kind of applications are these? And who's funding for your infrastructure? You can't just grow the infrastructure, right? Are the apps teams funding it even though you're not charging back?
Yeah, so lots of good questions there. So what is the difference between apps and apps instances? That's a very good question. And I think in the world of PCF, I still don't understand it, right? And one of the things I think you'll see is that, especially in the world of microservices and domain services, and then the way the sort of culture of how orgs and spaces are stood up and they differentiate between different silos of your business, the concept, I mean, PCF has a definition of an app, and sort of that's what we use. But to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what that delineation is. App instances is much easier to sort of wrap our heads around, right? So, so that hopefully answers that question. In terms of the funding, so we have an infrastructure group. So they're in charge of all the hardware, operating systems, infrastructure, a lot of the middleware, and so forth. All of the funding for this came out of that group, and that was part of the decision to not do chargebacks to the teams. And so what we sort of landed on was we really want everyone to use it. Let's try to just kind of put some out there and kind of commit to funding it for a little while and seeing what happens. And if no one uses it, then we don't have to buy any more hardware, right? So, so we had enough to sort of cushion for a little bit of expansion. But I'll be honest, so that first time, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but when it was time to expand, that question came up, right? Like all of a sudden someone has to cut a check. And so that we had to remind everyone, but like, hey, you said, right? So, but it wasn't an issue at all. Leadership was totally on board. And that actually took a lot of coordination between 3 of our different organizations. So we have like an enterprise architecture group, we have the app development team group, and then we have the infrastructure. And so all 3 of those sort of had to come to that realization and agreement to make that happen. So it took a lot of coordination and trust between the different groups at our company. So, good question. Anything else? Yeah.
Those app instances, does that include the development instances, or that's only production?
No, so that's everything. But we don't really have hardly anything running in the sandbox. Like there's probably a dozen. There is a ton of stuff in non-production. So once we announced it, we essentially got tons of requests to like, yeah, I want a little dev space. And at this point in time, it's a lot of just feeling it out. Where we came from was an environment where it was really difficult just to get servers to install stuff on. It was Java only. We had Tomcat, and that was essentially it. And if you wanted to install things or play with things or experiment, you had to be very creative and know people. So once we had made this out, or we put this out and we made the announcement, we had tons of people that were sort of itching for something like this. They were used to working on other alternatives, Heroku, AWS, and so forth. So for them, it was a natural leap. They're like, finally, right? And to be honest, it wasn't something I think that we anticipated, but it happened pretty organically and pretty quickly. Any other questions? Yeah. We'll get to that towards the end. So I'll let you, I don't know exactly here. Yeah. Yeah.
We have 1:8. One application has 8 instances.
Right.
4 in prod and 4 in non-prod. So something similar.
Yeah. So, and due to us, what I would say, and we'll talk about this in a moment, but for us, we had a lot of one-to-one. So we had a lot of applications that we were putting on the platform that were not scaled with multiple instances. And it's sort of this monolithic culture that was kind of carrying over onto the platform. But again, apps could have been a sandbox by a developer, right? It could have been, I'm going to try something, and then they leave it there for 3 months, and they don't touch it again, right? So there was a lot of those things, too. And then when we get later into the talk, we'll talk about what happens when we find that. And so we have to battle that as well in keeping our what people are asking for with what they're using pretty low. Any other questions? So yeah, so I would say there were two real production apps. There were probably a half dozen sort of in the wings that were going to be in production soon. So that, at least that was the plan. So we had probably about a half dozen of like real, honest to God, like applications. All right, October 2015, we're up to 168 app instances. So what are some cool things going on in October? Not a whole lot. One of the reasons for this is we had a data center incident which impacted our non-prod production for about 5 days. The good thing that came out of this is one of the very first times that we got all of these very important stakeholders in the platform together to talk about something. So we had a great blameless retro that involved networking, infrastructure, myself. We pulled Pivotal in as well. And we talked, really what we focused on was like, hey, we were down for 5 days. Like, can we get that to 3 days, 2 days, 1 day? And we found lots of opportunities for improvement. Some of it was just education on our part. But again, I think this was important because it kind of sparked the first time where all parties involved that are needed to keep the platform up and healthy sort of got together and talked. Another interesting thing here is how many people have been to like a Pivotal like Cloud Foundry workshop? Okay, so they were doing these at our company as well, and they had been doing them for a couple months, and it's basically hands-on keyboard. You're interacting with the command line interface. You're learning how to push apps and do security groups and a bunch of other stuff. So this was the first time I attended one myself. I think a couple people from my team had attended it earlier. But this is important because I think this concept of like workshops and education will play an important theme over sort of like a user adoption. And so we're going to come back and revisit this concept of workshops in a little bit. All right, so moving on from boring October, November 2015. 220 app instances. So there's another sort of hallmark moment that happens here. So we have another one of these dev forums, which is what we call this monthly gathering of our development community, and we like to do announcements and so forth. So I come back out on stage again, and really this time it was really short. All I'm pitching is we have all these people using Slack. Can we all just combine into like one big Slack? So Dylan's team on the infrastructure side, they were one of the, probably the first early adopter of Slack, and they were using it internally. And so we had built up a lot of these people who are like, oh, there's a Slack somewhere, I'll just go set up my stuff over there. So I think you guys had like around 300 people. I don't remember the number.
Yeah, 400 or 500.
Yeah. Okay. So there was 400 or 500 people using Slack, and then we had probably a dozen, if not more, like smaller Slacks going on. And so we had all these like little fiefdoms of Slack going on. And we're like, hey, we're kind of defeating the purpose. Like my phone, I had like 8 teams I was a member of and switching between them. So this kind of was a turning point, I think, in our overall transformation. And I think the lesson here for us was establishing a reliable cadence for communicating to the community. So that manifests itself in one way with these dev forums. And we've had a culture of doing those in the past, and I think reusing those and to talk about Cloud Foundry and some other things was really important. But really what I'm talking about here is Slack. Slack will kind of emerge as our general way of engaging our community. And we'll touch upon that in a little bit, why that's significant. So what else is going on? So for us, our Slack channel went from 150 people, and it doubled overnight to 300. We piloted the first self-provisioning application, and I use application like very loosely. It was essentially, it would write an email to us saying to go provision something. So we put that and made it available for non-production. And then, so Josh, who at the time was a solutions architect for Pivotal in our account, he came up to me randomly and he was like, hey, have you guys thought about just running these workshops your own, or on your own? And I didn't give it much thought, right, at the time. I was like up to my neck and stuff I didn't understand, just trying to keep ahead of things. So we didn't give it much thought. but it will come back around again. I also did a videotape talk at a Cloud Foundry meetup in Colorado. And really what I talked about was that production incident earlier that took 4.5 hours. And really that talk was centered around, this is what Cloud Foundry has taught us about our company just a few months in. And really it exposed a lot of inadequacies with our process and our politics and our bureaucracy and our red tape. So this kind of got passed around internally, and they kind of marketed it as orange tape, and it kind of became this list of things that were seen as hindrances or inhibitors for our teams to be productive. And I think this was important because there were a lot of other discussions about this agile transformation and a bunch of other things, and I think this aligned itself very well and actually gave us some concrete deliverables and action items to like go out and solve. And so I think it was pretty beneficial. So fast forward, December 2015, we saw a pretty big jump. So we went from 220 to 341. And one of the main reasons for this is that we started really doubling down on making the platform accessible for our users. So essentially what we did is we took out a bunch of this, forms and permissions and stuff like that, and then we actually got out of the way ourselves. And then we just let the developers go as automated and as self-service as possible directly to the platform. And then while this is happening, Josh comes up to me again, and he's like, hey, have you guys considered running your own workshops? And this time I was like, all right, we'll give it a shot. So we went and attended 1 or 2 more to make sure we kind of had the pitch down. We borrowed some slides. We tweaked some things. And so we were gearing up to start doing these workshops ourselves and running them internally. We added self-provisioning for production. This, again, was like a really big paradigm shift for us. Getting stuff in production that you had credentials to was sort of unheard of at the time for a lot of the teams. And then there's this thing called Will It Connect Madness. How many people have heard of Will It Connect? Go Google that. It's pretty awesome. I think did Josh write? I think Josh wrote the first version of it, yeah. So essentially, it's an app you install and on a platform or a foundation. And you can log, it's sort of like a GUI, and you can go there and you can say, hey, can I connect to this thing from within the foundation? And it'll allow you to put in proxies and a bunch of other stuff. We use this exhaustively at Home Depot with our very complicated network and firewall rules to figure out what exactly can talk to what from each foundation. And so there's all sorts of forks of this and deployments of this going on, but it's pretty funny. And then we also removed the need to request org managers. So any team could sign up and be an org manager, but in order to actually search for users and add them to your org, you had to have this special permission that had to map to an Active Directory group. And so we had the bright idea of just sort of mapping that to a group that most people already belong to. I know it sounds complicated, but it was a pretty simple solution. And so this freed up about 90% of the requests that we get for people to actually be org managers. And so I think once December, like end of December rolled around, like this was sort of the first time that we really felt like the platform was accessible and self-serviceable and self-provisioning for our developers. So lesson 5 is remove all barriers to entry, human or otherwise. So if there were any forms in the way, if there were any permissions, groups, security, any of that stuff, we worked really hard, almost around the clock for a couple months to, sometimes that meant banging on someone's door in security and saying like, hey, do you really need a data owner for this? And so there's a lot of discussions, but I think it was really worth it, and I think we saw a nice jump in sort of adoption once we did this. All right, any questions on that part so far, or? Okay. So January 2016, and I think this is where you'll start to see the steady climbing of a rate of adoption. So in January 2016, there were 587 app instances. And this was sort of the moment, especially with the workshops, where the people kind of becomes the master. So in 2016, we started running several of these PCF workshops. And what I mean by several is we were doing 2 a week, every week for about 4 months. And each of those classes had anywhere from 10 to 25 or 50 developers. So all in all, in less than a year, we had over 800 developers that went through the workshop. And what we actually saw were that people who would go to the workshops would start doing workshops themselves. So I don't know how big this number is, but I mean, I would be walking randomly by a conference room and I would see like a breakfast technology talk on Cloud Foundry where there was some version of the workshop and maybe catered to Spring or something else. And so it became organic and kind of took on its own sort of life form about like, hey, everyone's an instructor and everyone's giving workshops and come to this one and come to that one. And so I thought it was pretty cool. And I think it was one of the most important things that we did is as a company, we sort of took on this attitude that we wanted to get everyone educated about what this meant. And then to do it in a way that was scalable. And that meant for us to do it ourselves. So what does that mean? So this is where I started to first realize that you had to be much more, you had to go beyond just operating the platform. Like you had to be an advocate, a teacher, and you had to sort of be a thought leader in the space, right? Like if you wanted people to adopt this, they had to understand the concepts. You had to break down cultural barriers within your company. You had to have very difficult conversations with your own leadership sometimes and with other leadership. And so it's very challenging, but I think it's also one of the reasons why I think being a platform operator in a company that's interested in change is one of the most important roles that you can have at your company. All right, fast forward. Any questions there? Okay. February 2016, the curve keeps going up. So at this point, we're at 874 app instances. One of the big changes here is that we actually tweaked and rebranded the workshop. So we removed some of the deeper CF topics. One example is security groups. We weren't using them extensively or actually at all at Home Depot. So we removed that completely. And we started adding topics that we found were being asked pretty frequently on Slack or in email or in person. So we added a lot of talks around organizational change topics. So again, GitHub was new for us. So there was like, what are some of the best practices on how to use Git and branching? Slack etiquette, surprisingly, was a pretty big topic. There was a lot of conversations about people not feeling comfortable about talking in Slack when they knew that their leadership and their managers would be there. There was lots of fear around, is this going to show up on my review? What if that person's idea gets a lot more thumbs up than mine? Does it mean I'm wrong or I'm not as smart? And so when we started having these conversations with the developers, it was pretty eye-opening. And so we had lots of talks internally about sort of the role of our leadership, especially at the higher levels, and sort of some of the things they had to be aware of when they're engaging developers over something like Slack. We also talked about what it meant to be a full-stack developer, primarily around the support model. And then we talked about what pair programming was and some of those things. So to sort of eat our own dog food, this is, I think, might be off by a month here and there, but this is where the team sort of hunkered down and said, we're going to start doing 100% paired programming. We kind of toyed with the idea, and I left it up to the team for a while. I was like, hey, what do you guys think about pair programming? Like, oh, we'll try it, and we'd have some people try it. And then I just sort of came to the conclusion, I'm like, look, we're just going to put it on the calendar. We're going to wake up one day, we're going to do it. And then we're going to have lots of retrospectives of why it sucks or what's hard about it or what we don't like about it. And I would say after like the third or fourth month, probably took 2 months before we really dug down into like the interrelational like people issues that come along with pair programming. And then once we did that, I think we got much better at it. And I think it was very beneficial. We don't do it 100%. So I would like to think that we've evolved, but there's a lot of non-programming parts to what we do. And so depending on some of the things, like we sort of mandate that you have to do it in a pair. But if there's sort of trivial tasks like answering a question to the community or something like that, obviously we don't pair. So, but yeah, so this brought up the next lesson, which was we had to establish a scalable customer service and support model. Like I said, we have 3,000 developers. PCF was sort of taking a mind of its own. And if you thought about the support model before, the platform that we had was run by this team. and the developers didn't have a lot of say over what they did and how they did it. And so when anything went wrong, they would have to come to that team to ask the questions like, hey, this is broken, fix it for me. This doesn't work, fix it for me. And so there's a lot of like developers waiting around for the one team that knew all the answers to sort of answer those questions. But when you're in a polyglot environment and you're just dealing with lots of languages, some of which my team doesn't know anything about, we don't know all the answers to Ruby and Spring. We don't know all the answers to Node and so forth. So we had to come up with a different way of engaging for support. So we highly encouraged pair programming. And so we came up with this level of support escalation. And we actually encouraged it during the workshops by trying to have people work in pairs. And so what we thought was like, look, if you don't know the answer, ask your pair. And if your pair together doesn't know the answer, then go into Slack and ask there. Hopefully, someone from the community already knows the answer and has done it. And we actually, I would encourage the team to sort of put 15-minute timers on them answering questions in Slack just to give the community time to sort of chime in and get them kind of pushed to supporting their fellow developers. And then if that didn't work, then my team would try to come in if we knew the answer. Oftentimes we didn't. And then that's when you finally did what all respectable developers do. You go to Google and the internet and you figure out how to do stuff. So this is when we introduced the concept of an interrupt pair that we stole from Pivotal while we were visiting one of the offices. So we're trying to do all these deliverables. We had 4 pairs working all the time. And we would constantly get barrage, questions and emails and Slack and notifications. And you didn't know if it was going to like an email address of an admin or if they were going to ping someone individually or they would ping me. And so we're like, look, every week, every iteration, we're going to dedicate one of these pairs to answer all of the questions. We're going to put them in the top of our Slack channel, let everyone know who they are. And then that sort of became the support model moving forward. Another thing that I'm very, very, very super proud of is the fact that we do, I don't know what you call it, I call it conversational support. So we have no tickets and we have no queues. There's no form to go fill out to have someone do something for you. If you need a build pack, you don't have to go get a ticket. You don't have to email someone and wait. You can just go right to Slack and ask, and then we'll have a conversation with you and be like, hey, I'm working on this, and I'll get back to you. I had some people sort of push back and like, hey, is that scalable? And I was like, I have no idea. I don't know. It is right now. We'll see what happens. But I think what we didn't anticipate is how much of the support responsibility the community actually picked up themselves. And so I really do feel like this has been a scalable and sustainable model for us. And it's still the model that we try to live by today. The one thing I wish that we did have that we don't currently is sort of like a list of known issues. When we did have a couple of issues, it was nice to sort of not have to answer the same question like 200 times. Everyone would jump into the Slack channel and be like, hey, why isn't this working? And you're like, scroll up, like you're like the 80th person to ask. But honestly, that hasn't come up too often. So I still like this model. I think the feedback from our customers has been super positive and reinforcing, and so that part of me makes me feel like we're doing the right thing there. Any questions so far on any of that? Yep.
So you might be having a legacy application, right? So are you pair programming for language, specifically or
Okay, so the question about my team doing paired programming on legacy. Mm-hmm. So I think the question's around like if they're migrating a legacy application. Yeah, so we'll talk about migration in a moment. Yes, so we have a whole chalkboard lesson around that, and we'll get to it in just a couple more sections. It's a very good question. So the question is around migration and what do you migrate and how do you decide which one to move off the legacy onto the new one. This is a question that came up, and we'll talk about that specifically in just a moment. So, yep.
So you said initially you were doing non-critical applications.
So what the applications are critical, but I would say the yeah. So our tool rental team, right? So when you go to Home Depot and you rent tools, it used to be that you could sort of rent tools sort of indefinitely, and no one would come after you because the system. I hope it's okay to say this. Yeah, hopefully I have a job in a couple of weeks. No, so they actually built an application that handled sort of following up with those, printing out contracts, coming up with financial repercussions, and then calculating those dollar amounts. So there were several applications that were legit. Our Pro Paint and our Paint sections were also doing some things. But for us at Home Depot with 2,000 stores, what we do is we'll kind of test things out in 1 or 2 stores so that if there is an issue, like it's not impacting our entire company at once, right? So, so when I mean critical, I would say they're real apps. However, their ability to impact our entire business is not critical.
Were they deployed as like microservices that would talk to the web, or microservices that talk to APIs to the mobile, or?
Yep. Yeah. So a lot of it's all web. So one of the concepts that they were moving towards is, with 2,000 stores, we had a lot of logic and networking and stuff that lived at each store. I think one of the things that Cloud Foundry is starting to do is given this concept of like centralized computing so that our stores can go and talk to servers hosted somewhere else to retrieve data. And so I think most of these applications were architected that way. But to be honest, I think one of the things that we learned very quickly is that there were so many things going on in the platform that we just had no idea about. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, about how important at an IT strategy level it sort of is to know some information about that. But they're real apps. I would just say they were sort of scoped in such a way that if there was something wrong, it wouldn't impact our entire, like a business line or something like that. Yeah, good question. Yep. Yeah, so we are, most of the things going on are in Atlanta, and there's actually 2 or 3 offices now in Atlanta. A large part of our infrastructure team and our data services and stuff are in Austin. We have a sizable contingency in Dallas as well. There's a team that we have through an acquisition that's in San Francisco. So we do have some development going on in lots of places. In terms of the organizational change, I would say there's like a lot of local leaders and thought leaders sort of at each of these spaces that would sort of kind of carry the torch. But when we did these big dev forum or announcements, like we do it in such a way that all the sites are kind of coming in together. And then again, Slack was a huge, huge, huge bonus to sort of connecting all the sites and getting people to talk. Over the first 2 or 3 months, like you wouldn't believe the amount of messages that were going across about like, I didn't know you were working on that, I'm working on that. And it's like we have 8 teams sort of working on very similar things. And so there was a lot of those discovery moments. But in terms of organizational change, there's some, I think it's more around roles and responsibilities and what does DevOps mean and QA and product management and project management. There's a lot of those talks going on. But at the developer level, I think we're still just kind of getting on there and doing things and innovating and writing code. So, all right. Yep.
So how did you navigate around security to say Slack is secure and safe, or is it guidelines that they said if you only use it for these use cases?
You did most of the negotiations with that, so yeah. So the question is, yeah. So the question was around security and getting sign off of that from Slack. So. So Dylan Timbrink from our infrastructure team kind of brokered that deal and did a lot of that facilitation. So he could probably do a whole talk on that. So yep. What's that? That's coming up. So when we talk about the big thing that happened, that's one of the big things. So March 2016, I'm going to move along because we're going to be running out of a little bit of time. But so we're up to 1,258 app instances. So this was our busiest month to date, and actually it's still our busiest month ever for the workshop. So we did 250 people through the workshop. It was the most in a single month. Another cool thing that I think we did is we created this channel called PCF Operators that was essentially, most of the time when Dylan, myself, and networking and security had to sort of get in touch with each other and talk about all of the magic sausage making in the back that happened to keep the platform up and running. We sort of did it through direct messages and privately. And what we found out is that there was a lot of value in sort of doing that publicly and transparently. One is it kind of allowed me to keep a cool head, as I think the rest of us. And then two is it really gave a lot of our development community who were probably a little bit more technically inclined or interested in the topic, they had a place where they could go and sort of idle and be a fly on the wall and see all of the very interesting and hard problems that we were solving on a day-to-day basis. And it was also a really good way to sort of keep up-to-date second-by-second status on issues as we were tackling them. So yeah, so it was public. It was basically built for Matrix team to engage. And we actually invited Pivotal to that channel. So this was a really, I think it was a really cool way for them to be a fly on the wall as well, sort of keeping up to speed with some of the things that were happening, some of the challenges. You know, they would cut and paste text and send it to like engineers and support people and be like, hey, do you know about this and what's going on? That being said, like we didn't expect them to do that. They kind of did that out of their own accord from time to time. And then also for the people that were our dedicated support engineers, we invited them as well, and it became another channel to sort of engage them for questions and support. All right, April 2016. Yeah, so there's not such a huge jump here. So yeah, what could possibly be going on here? Well, this gets to that topic. So production's running out of capacity. And this is happening just as another one of these dev forums or / in this case, it's an IT announcement. So I think I'm going to come out and I'm going to tell the dev community something, but nope, not this time. It's not me talking, it's our leadership. And essentially they dropped the bombshell that is like, hey, PCF is now the strategic platform of choice for all development. And this is as we're running out of capacity. There's a lesson learned that I'm not going to put up here. Moving forward, May 2016, so the suspense is building, right? Huge jump, right? Most of this is primarily happening in non-production, but this is the power of your leadership coming out and saying, this is what everyone should do, right? So prod runs out of capacity. That happens. This is us. So we start reacting. So we turn off self-provisioning in production, arguably too late, you know. So the lesson here is don't run out of capacity, right? No, seriously, don't run out of capacity. I think the key thing here is get really good at metrics and monitoring. Yeah, go ahead. That is a very good question. And honestly, I think you could do an entire talk on monitoring this very ephemeral, dynamic sort of infrastructure that can move, and it's got a lot of automated pieces. It's very difficult. It's like, I don't know if folks have ever seen Inception, but it's like 2 or 3 levels of deep of like Legos almost, right? And you're sort of like, you have like a little box that you can build Legos in, and then you can have so many of those boxes, and they all fit within a bigger box. And so when you're monitoring that, it becomes very difficult. We thought we had about 20% memory available, but it's not that simple. And so we learned that very quickly. Lesson 9, and I kind of touched on it, be careful about your choice of words. So again, so the message that came out was, it's a platform of choice, use PCF, right? So based on some feedback and some of the things that we were seeing that were being migrated or ported, there was a lot of middle management that interpreted this as I have to go build stuff on PCF, right? Like I have to use PCF. And that really wasn't the intent. So we kind of changed the wording of that, and we said, hey, build 12-factor apps, and PCF just happens to be the best place to do that. And so this really had to do with teams that were lifting and shifting sort of their monolithic apps and then putting them on the platform to kind of be compliant and good citizen, corporate citizens. And so we didn't want that to happen, right? We saw this as like our fresh, clean environment, and we didn't want to bring that sort of stuff over. So now we've kind of gone back and we've addressed that, and I think we're doing a better job. So, all right, June 2016. This is when it gets really crazy. So one of the things that we realized is that there was teams sort of like queuing up adding stuff, right? So we turned off self-provisioning. Teams still want to use it. So all that's happening is that there's a lot of teams that are kind of building up a want to use it, but they can't yet. And so these things are kind of like queuing up. This is when we stand up a second production foundation. We increase the capacity a little bit on the existing one. And then, red alert, major incident, our first major incident at Home Depot, ironically enough, not related to capacity. And essentially, we had, due to some edge case network configurations in the new foundation, we had some apps that were sort of tying up max connections to a very important database that other app teams were using. And so that caused some issues. So there's me. Here's my boss. I'm freaking out. But my boss was cool. He's like, it's okay. We're all still learning. And I'm like, that's awesome. I'm going to have a job still. And then lesson 10. So, and I talked about this in the talk I gave several months ago, but you can't overreact to the first incident. This is how you avoid like the operational scarring, right? And it's you have to have great leaders to do this. Like as a good leader, one of the best things we can do is create safe environments for our folks to work in. You get to a lot of the bureaucracy and the red tape and the politics by reacting to incidents. And so when one team does something as a company to protect ourselves, we tend to kind of implement new procedures and politics to protect everyone else from possibly doing that. And I think it's much more important to sort of address these on a team-by-team basis. Another thing we learned is you have to have a dedicated team dedicated to PCF. So the team was sort of juggling lots of things, right? We were supporting the old platform. We were also supporting our messaging infrastructure. We were supporting this new platform that everyone was jumping on. And we just sort of were getting a little thin. And so one of the lessons is that you kind of have to just hunker down and do a thing and do it well. This also brought up a topic that came up from time to time about 6 months in. I was asked kind of periodically, it's like, hey, when are you going to hand this over to support? And I was like, I don't think we really need to yet. Like, there's not a whole lot going on. But when this incident happens, there's actually people calling into a call center. They're reacting, and they're like, what is PCF? Like, what are you talking about, right? They didn't know how to get a hold of us, right? They weren't fully engaged with, like, Slack and how we do support, right? So this is where kind of, asking for forgiveness and permission sort of, bit us in the behind a little bit, is that we kind of didn't engage the rest of the company with, like, hey, here's how you can get a hold of us. I'm all a fan of us supporting our own thing, and it's really difficult for the team. We have very talented engineers. The last things they want to do is get paged at 3 a.m. That being said, it's one of the things I'm most proud about, as I would ask the team periodically, like, hey, do you want to give this, you want to hire a team to support this? And they all said no. And I think they really bought into the culture of DevOps, and they were like, look, it breaks. That sucks. I don't want to get up in the middle of the night, but at the same time, like, I want to write something that prevents it from breaking or lets me know that it's going to break a day in advance. So I was really proud of that. I'm proud of them still. So good job, guys. July 2016, so we're almost getting real time here. I think this is 3,803. So we're going to talk a little bit about what today looks like by the numbers. So we have around 3,000 apps, 4,000 instances. As a company, we have close to 6,000 people in Slack. Over 1,100 of those are in the Cloud Foundry channel. We have 1,300 unique platform users. This is not including Pivotal Tracker. We don't count those numbers. We have 6 foundations, and we have several more planned before the end of the year that have to do with our engagements with Google and Microsoft. And we had 14,000 CF pushes, 1,500 of those in production, and that was in the month of June alone. We have 2 billion log messages per month, and logging, let me tell you, is one of the toughest things to solve right now, and we still kind of struggle with that every day. So a couple of like parting lessons. Lessons 12, don't police developers. So we got out of the business of trying to tell them what they can and can't do. They can do anything. Cloud Foundry is really good at not allowing you to like go and mess with other people's stuff. But what we do instead of having approvals and like, hey, what are you doing? What's your intent? What's your app? What are your impacts? We get out of the way, just go do a thing. But then what we do, that a lot of them don't know, is we're sort of looking at metadata and analytics in the background to sort of see what they're doing on the platform. And then based on these analytics, you can sort of single out people and teams and then have a follow-up discussion. So instead of having this thing where it's like, hey, everyone has to tell me what they're doing, we got out of that business. We're like, we trust 99% of you that you're doing the right thing. And for the 1% that are not, we have a way to kind of go in and say, hey, are you still building monolithic apps or are you building microservices? And a good way to look at that is you can see the orgs that are requesting memory increases over and over again. And so their apps are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but they're only running one instance, right? And so that's a pretty good indication that you're not scaling the right way. And so we can fire off some emails, friendly emails, and go have a talk. And again, it's not our job to tell them how to architect their app. But what we can do is we will have a conversation, get their architects involved, and say, hey, is there any way that we can pair with you? We have a concept of like design crits, where we can look at APIs, look at code. We should be rolling that out to the company in a couple months, I hope. So what's next? So we get into this a little bit. But right now, we have a big challenge. We need to motivate our teams to be more lean with their capacity. So we have plans to do a showback model. So even though it doesn't really cost them anything, it costs our company something. And so the hope is that by showing them how much it costs, that they'll be better or more, I guess, responsible with how much they're using. A part of this, we started some work about looking at how efficient you are with what you're asking for. And we plan on rolling out some reports around that. This kind of will tie into the aha moment, but we started like trying to remove all the matrix dependencies for teams. So there's a lot of teams that are still doing like firewall requests, DNS requests, connectivity, like all sorts of these little things. So we're trying to kind of code and automate our way out of those so that teams don't have to focus on that at all. And then do the capacity stuff, we really beefed up the smoke tests. And then as a part of our takeaway from engaging the PDubs operator team, they had this concept where the community or the app teams themselves could contribute back smoke tests that would get rolled up into our builds so that when we're doing platform upgrades or changes, we can actually roll or run their tests to make sure their applications are still working. Let's see, what else? So the aha moment, right? So here's us, here's the team. I think one of the most important things that I found is that we don't really operate like a platform. Not so much as we enable our developers. So in all pure definition of the word, we kind of are a product team, right? So we have managers, we groom backlogs, we take lots of feedback, we collect user metrics and analytics, we figure out what people want and what they need, we prioritize. And then those people are our development community. They're our customers. So for us, I see this as like one of the most important jobs to have at any company who's trying to impact change. You're sort of the center of the universe. You see a broad stroke, a very broad stroke of like what all the teams are doing, what their issues are, their challenges, and you sort of become like this voice of the development community to everyone in the back. And so we're working closely with our data services people. We're working closely with infrastructure, networking, security. And we're sort of conveying all of these messages and saying, like, look, this is what's going on in our community. How can we fix it? It wasn't in the job description. Like, no one asked us to do that. It just sort of manifested itself. But I'm really passionate about it, and I think it's super important. So with that being said, thank you. Are there any questions or comments? I don't know how much time we have, so. 10 minutes maybe? Yep, 10 minutes, so yes.
Are you running a hybrid solution where you're running in public and the private cloud code and you code?
Yeah, so right now it's all on-prem. Chris Grant just spoke a little bit earlier. Yeah, so The strategy is definitely a hybrid solution, and it mostly revolves around sort of proximity to data and sensitivity of data. So I think we'll have stuff in Google, we'll have stuff in Microsoft, and we plan on having stuff on-prem. We did sort of create like a DNS type solution for like routing your apps between foundations. I don't know how that's going to work when we go to that hybrid model, but we'll tackle that when we get there. So, good question. Yes?
Why not use a chargeback model?
Chargeback model. Yeah. That's been a struggle for us. So again, it's kind of funny money. And you can do that all you want, but at the end of the day, it's like you still have to go and get someone to pay for it, right? It's all on paper. I just don't think we're equipped for it, like from a financial perspective and a PMO. Like we don't have the right tools for that. Like when does your stuff expire? When do you have to renew? What if your product code changes? Like it's like your credit card expiring. It's just kind of easy the way it is now. So I don't know. It's working for us, but yeah. Yep.
Just to add to that, I'm a developer. Come yesterday with me all the time, asking questions and stuff. If we had to pay for instances and rooms of management, we would try nearly the amount of things that we would want to do. Not that it's so easy and I can spin up an instance in like 10 minutes and deploy an app to it. Makes me do it even if I just delete the app.
Yep. Oh, tons. I don't know. Drew, do you have a guess? How many apps on the old platform?
Applications we have, I think roughly 10 to 11, I mean 1,000 to 1,100 apps.
Okay. And I would say those apps compared to these apps are like, it's not apples to apples, right? So.
Yeah, that's earlier in our schedule. That's applications.
Right. Capital A.
Roughly
Yeah.
5 to 10 times that instance.
Right. Yep. Oh, sorry. So the question was how many applications are running on the old platform? So it's around 1,000, 1,100, something like that. Yep.
So do you have any metrics as to how successful this approach is altogether? Are people able to produce things faster, deploy things faster?
We get asked that a lot, right? Everyone wants to know the ROI. I don't know. I'm sure we're focusing on that a lot. I'm not, but we have leadership that is. I'm more concerned sort of about like morale. I know it sounds weird. Keeping talent, like, when we get talent out of college, like they're used to working with platforms like this. They want to have a full like range of languages that they can work on. So I think for us, like some of the things that we're tracking are frequency of deployments, time to market. I don't have statistics on those because again, it's something that we're starting to track. Yep. We will see. So we have our big company survey coming out. I suspect they are. The feedback's been really good. I suspect they are. And everyone that uses it loves it. It's been a huge success for us for sure. Yep. And there's a lot of developers in the room from Home Depot, so don't take my word for it. So. Yeah, so that's actually a really big challenge for us right now. So we don't really have sort of an enterprise approach to that. Right now, we have a lot of teams that are trying out different things. I think what we're landing on is that this is another area where my team will probably have to get engaged to help come up with something, at least something that'll fit the needs of like 80% of the people. But we still want to have teams be able to innovate and do their own pipelines. But
I'm surprised that you're successful as far as the amount of applications you have on the platform.
Well, so again, we don't have like an enterprise solution, but there are lots of teams that are doing their own thing. So there's teams using Concourse, Travis, Drone, Jenkins. There's a lot of Jenkins use still. There's lots of teams doing lots of things. We just don't have like an overarching like enterprise solution to that yet.
That's really helpful around OI is platform extension.
Yep, absolutely. Yes, another question.
Can you talk about some of the challenges you have with your legacy platform and how Zscaler addresses them?
Some of the challenges with actually, I'm pretty proud of our legacy platform. It's been very stable and reliable, but it's all in physical hardware. And so when you want to get more, you have to be, I think, you tend to overestimate a lot more, right? Like when you provision, probably.
So, I've been around a long time, so I'm sure on the biggest, I'd say that easily the biggest thing implementation on the whole platform is it's Java and Tomcat, right? It's not Polyglot, there's none of that. It was a different mindset for Home Depot. We were trying to insulate and hide things from the developers, so there's a lot of, some would look at them as restrictions. We didn't look at, we looked as trying consistency is what we were after, right? And so the developers were guided down a path, right? And a lot of stuff happened through the tooling they were unaware of. So as we moved to the full stack developers, right, we're trying to open this up and engage the developers and innovate and that kind of stuff. Those became confines instead of stability, right? So there's trade-offs, but I'd say the biggest one easily is the polyglot stuff.
Yeah, I would agree.
That the whole platform before PCF came of, hey, we want to do Python, hey, we want to do this, and we were just like, the grid doesn't do that, right? So I would say that's big.
Yeah, I agree. So the question was around like one of the bigger advantages over the old platform, and again, I think it's developer choice, having more development languages, container options. I think there's a lot more tooling probably around like, monitoring and logging. We had to build a lot of that stuff out of, from scratch and then maintain that. So, and then it's all virtualized, which does make it a little bit easier to go to the cloud and do some other things. So, yep, good question. Yes?
Two questions on paired programming. When did you first start using it before you moved to 100% in March of this year? And are there any roles, supporting roles you have created to work in that environment, along with just putting developers into pair programming?
So the questions around pair programming, how long do we do it? I mean, a lot of the people on the team had done it sort of in spats or spurts. Like I had done it before in previous companies. A couple other people have. They would, we sort of allowed the team to sort of volunteer whenever they wanted to. We really encourage pairing with other teams. So we'll take someone from our team and then pair them with an application team to work on a problem together, hopefully in a manner that makes it reusable for the rest of our company. Yeah, I mean, you could have a whole talk on that. There's a lot of challenges. Technically, we've had challenges with security and credentials and logging into systems, creating a safe like sandbox from a data perspective. When you go to labs and you work there, right, they've been doing that for so many years. They've solved a lot of those things for them in a way. And then when you come back from labs, like you're sort of meeting those challenges. Some of them technical, a lot of them just cultural and personal. So I would say it's very important to have really good, candid, transparent retrospectives. That helped us a lot, I think. We use Tracker, yes. So we use Tracker. Yeah, but we have a lot of teams that use Jira, I think, still. But most teams are using Tracker now. So we have about 3 more minutes. Any other questions? Yeah.
With respect to frugality of the company, and how many of these apps, 2,000 apps, are Spring Music apps?
Or Spring what?
Spring Music apps.
Spring Music?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
how do you deal with apps that are not being used, with respect to apps that are used, and like for training, and are you scaling them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. Hopefully, once we get the showback model and you get some of that visibility to that, we'll know. But I will say, it's kind of getting real, though, when you start getting calls at 3 in the morning. Like, there's legit stuff that breaks. Sometimes it's, our fault, but most of the time it's not. But at the same rate, at least you know that there's some, critical things that are running on the platform. It's becoming very, very real. It is real, yeah.
How big is your team?
My team is myself. We have 8 sort of engineers. Drew is our architect. But there's so many people sort of behind the scenes. Like Dylan has an entire team of infrastructure people. I interface mostly with him, so I don't even know sort of where all of that work goes. We have a couple people from networking and security. So they're sort of still working in their silos, but they've kind of taken it on themselves to be really passionate about making sure the platform is successful. So they do dedicate a lot of their time to helping out with it, for sure. Yep, we do. Yeah. So the question's around quota. Yeah, so we do. We have like sort of escalating quota plans, and it's one of the things that still isn't self-serviced. And it is still one of the areas where we'll kind of prod and ask some questions, but we never say no. But again, it does kind of give us, alert us to be like, hey, there's a team asking for quota increases all the time for memory when they should be scaling. So I think we have about 30 seconds. Yep.
How do you design your orgs and spaces? Does every team get their own org, or how do you?
We let them do whatever they want. It's up to them. Yep. We don't really, we can try to offer guidelines, but we've kind of gone back and forth on that, and every team's different. Some of them do it around teams, some of them do it around products. Some people have done it around like a portfolio. It's really up to them. Yep. We don't really police that at all.
Tony, so we'll be happy to answer a gazillion questions out in the hallway. So
Yep.
find them. There's a whole bunch of Home Depot folks in the room. We're happy to answer them until they're all done.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thank you. Ladies.